afternoon, everyone. So today we want to discuss the issue of the beginning of life, of human life. And this is an issue that science has been able to help us with in recent years, because this wasn't always very clear. To be honest, it wasn't always very clear. I remember when I was studying Dante, and we were talking about St. Thomas Aquinas and his position on the beginning of life, and the medieval scholars were saying, yes, that he himself was confused about when it began, because he was following the mindset of the three different types of souls: the vegetative, sensitive, and rational souls, plants, animals, and human beings. And he was thinking that the soul itself needed to develop from one to another. But we'll see in this presentation that that was not exactly the case. That is not how it happens. That one becomes a human being at conception. All right, so we'll begin discussing how this was very much part of what Norman Ford, this Salesian priest in 1988, wrote. He published this book, When Did I Begin? Conception of the Human Individual in History, Philosophy, and Science. And this book becomes very influential because in this book, he aimed to resolve this debate. How far can we trace back our own personal identity as the same continued individual living body, being, or entity? This is a very important topic in the whole debate on abortion. And he concluded that there is no human individual or soul until 2 or 3 weeks after fertilization or conception. And for the sake of clarity, we should say that almost 20 years later, Ford repudiated these conclusions of his. And in fact, he proved very significant. His thesis proved very significant, in fact, in the debates, for 3 concrete reasons. For the first reason, for example, he said that it's almost fully argued case. It's a almost fully argued case that delayed animation or animation, the anima, that's where that comes from. The soul. The delayed animation or hominization, making one like like an hominus, a man, is a view that the early human embryo is not a human being. This is very significant. The second point that makes it very significant is that Ford's book had implications for moral dilemmas around the manufacture or experimentation upon and destruction of human embryos and the use of abortifacient drugs, obviously. Because, if the baby is not a baby, then you can abort it, or you can use drugs or devices that will abort it. However, and you can also do whatever you want with experiments. And so this developed into the 14-day rule, allowing scientists in many countries to experiment upon human embryos up to the last stage, but not later, receiving its full intellectual justification, and no less by a Catholic priest and scientist who was a Salesian. Obviously this is huge. The third reason that it was significant is because it created much uncertainty around abortion by calling into question a premise of the pro-life case against abortion, which is that it's always wrong to kill an innocent human being, and from conception or fertilization, the human organism is an innocent human being, and therefore it's wrong to kill by abortion a human embryo or fetus. All of this is being put into question by this book, so you can imagine all the uproar that this caused. So, his second book, however, The Prenatal Person, Ethics from Conception to Birth, was written 20 years later, almost 20 years later. Here he explains, I should say 14 years later, because he published it in 2002. And here he explains the reasons for treating the human embryo as a person from conception onwards. So in this book, he changes his view because of science. He sees the reasons that we need to treat the human person as a person from conception onwards. However, the problem is that his first book was the one destined to have the enduring influence, because nobody wants to really hear, not nobody, but certain people in certain areas of the debate obviously don't want to hear what the truth is. And they want to make science become such an enduring, influential element, but they don't want to hear what science has to say when science doesn't say what they want it to say. Ford's work, however, is particularly significant for gathering biological information in early human development. And many critics have shown that the supposed objectivity of the scientific observer actually reflects considerable personal involvement. In his book, Ford thanks two embryologists, Alan Truzon and Roger Short, for their lectures and advice for his work. However, we have to understand that these two advisors were involved in experiments on embryos. So, today's dominant scientism view is ideological. Science has its value, but scientism is an ideology that uses science for other ends, and that's what we see here. We see that these two advisors of Ford, Truzon and Short, are involved in experiments on embryos. So obviously, they're not going to be interested in making a science that shows that they should not be doing that. So without doubting the integrity of the scientists, we can see, however, maybe that their perception of the embryo is that he's not a human being. So let's look at some of the key terms here. The scientific perspective, the analysis, there were three keywords. So the syngamy is one of the words. Then the idea, the question that we can ask is if extra embryonic tissues or embryonic organs are there. And then how do we understand the contact between cells? So the first word, syngamy, we'll first define it. And in biology, syngamy is the mixing of the hereditary elements that takes place in sexual reproduction between the sperm and the egg. That happens in the fertilization. It's the fusion of the pronuclei of the male and female gametes. And Ford states that fertilization is not a momentary event, but a process that lasts up to 24 hours. And then even then, in this earlier book of his, even then, one's not completely harmonized until 2 weeks into the process. Instead of being a long process, as Ford believed in 1988, however, we see that fertilization occurs very quickly. The fusion of the male and the female gametes is almost an instantaneous event, and this is what's key here. That the syngamy, the fusion of the the gametes is instantaneous. That's very important. Maureen Kondik, a specialist in neurobiology and anatomy, reviewing the latest in embryology, explains that in the union of the female and male gametes, the membranes of these two cells fuse, creating in this very instant a hybrid cell, which is, you know, the fusion between the egg and the sperm. And this is called the zygote, or the one-cell embryo. Cell fusion is well studied and very rapid, occurring in less than a second. It's wonderful to see how science is coming to support and to confirm what theology has been saying all along, what we're trying to support here, what we're trying to defend. And it's emphasizing and showing us that what we believe is not just a mere ideology, but it's true, it's reality. Then the question then becomes, if extraembryonic tissues, what happens to extraembryonic tissues in embryonic organs? And we see this issue in Ford's books, because he argues that the zona pellucida, which is the membrane that lines the fertilized egg, and the placental tissues are extra-embryonic membranes, he says, and they're not parts of the actual embryo. Ford's arguments for these tissues not being a part of the embryo proper are several. First of all, he says that they have no nerves and are insentient. But this is true also of several body parts that are part and parcel to the body, that not every part of the body has nerves and is sentient, and yet is part of the body. So this is an improper argument. The next argument he uses in this book, in the first book, he says that they're used only for the period of gestation and then are discarded. But we can then retort that many body parts, such as milk, teeth, hair, cells, like even skin cells, are discarded at one time or another. So that happens all the time. Continues to happen all the way to our death. Then he says that they can be shared by two fetuses. But this is true of almost all organs, we can retort, as is evidenced by various kinds of conjoined twins, the Siamese twins, for instance. And then he goes on to say that chimeras, where the cell lines from two or more genetically distinct organisms are incorporated into one, can be from a source genetically distinct from the rest of the embryo. However, here again, we can say that this is true of many organs of a chimera at every stage of development, but it's also true of adults who have received a transplant organ from another adult. So as you see, we can really break up his arguments very easily. So the next point that he makes is the contact, the contact between the cells. Ford states that in the embryo, in its earliest stages, the cells that make up the embryo are actually in close contact with each other, and although they have the appearance of a single organism or unit, they are actually in simple contact with each other and held by the zona pellucida as if in a kind of cage. The only explanation he gives for this thesis is that each cell takes its own nutrients independently. And most biologists, however, maintain that until the organism is developed to the point where it has organs responsible for nutrition, it is necessary for this to be the embryo's form of nourishment. In addition, a more recent review of the scientific literature has defined that the cells of the human embryo act together as a unit so that the organism develops as an individual of its own species. So they work together. So, it's normal in the end. So we can look at this also from a philosophical point of view. And, we can look at a number of issues like classical and contemporary metaphysics. We can use Ford's use of hylomorphism, the union between the soul and the body, problems with philosophical induction, and just ask ourselves about some just common sense in all of this. And so as we look at, the criterion of individuality and human personhood, we have to understand that the person is an individual rational substance, and that individuality has to do with what it is to be a person. And individuality has to be with what is not the other. That's what individual means. It is what one is and not the other. So the Son is not the Father, he is the Son. But he's defined by the Father, and the Father is defined by the Son, but each is individually distinct from the other. That's the point of the individuality. From a philosophical point of view, from the definition of personhood. And so what Ford does is he tries to establish the criteria determining when a human being begins. And he does not clarify specifically what these criteria are, but he uses them often in the book. So he talks about untwinnability, unchimmerability. He talks about species membership, genetic uniqueness, spatial oneness, spatial temporal continuity, differentiation of the parts, organization and direction. So he goes into a lot of different things to try to talk about the individuality of the person. And when he talks about untwinnability, for instance, here he asserts how the twinning of one zygote ceases to be and gives rise to two new ones. So this is what happens when you get the identical twins being split into two, you get one zygote forming two identical twins. And then he asserts that this can occur at any stage in the first 2 weeks, but no later. And then he says that all embryos have this potential. And from these assertions, he concludes that the embryo cannot be an individual because it can be divided, because it can form new embryos. Well, how do we reply to this? Because he says that the twin embryo in one individual has the possibility of becoming two, etc. Well, we think that, we look at this, it's like, we understand that asexual reproduction can be described in this, and yet it continues to exist and gives rise to identical offspring. And also we look at cloning. Will anyone claim that any adult with the potential to be cloned is not an individual? Ford ultimately demands of the embryo a standard of individuality that no adult human can satisfy in effect. Weinberg suggests a useful thought experiment. He says, imagine that we lived in a world in which a certain small percentage of teenagers replicated themselves by some mysterious natural means, splitting in two upon reaching their 16th birthday. We would not in the least be inclined to conclude that no human being could be therefore considered a person prior to become 16 years of age. Nor could we conclude that life could be taken with greater impunity prior to replication than afterwards. So, it's a good thought experiment to think about this. I mean, I can understand the intuition that Ford has, but the point is, in the end, that we are conceived in the tube and not inside the uterus. And that's important to keep in mind. The conception takes place there, not afterwards. So that's why it's important to have this clearly in mind, that the conception takes place at the contact between the two gametes. The journey that the embryo then takes from the moment of conception to the moment of the implantation in the uterus takes 5 to 7 days, depending on the case. And development takes 9 months. Things can happen. This fact has been strongly attacked in the last 30 years by a culture that Professor Giuseppe Noia calls a time-shifting culture. That is, it's very specious, very ephemeral. Ploys are used to try not to identify what is the beginning of human life and therefore of its own dignity. Instead of being a long process, as Ford believed in 1988, it is now known that fertilization occurs quickly. The fusion of male and female gametes is an almost instantaneous event, and that's the key point. And so the membranes of these two cells fuse, creating a single hybrid cell. And so we can ask ourselves, with all this, is the embryo a human individual? The crucial philosophical question here is to clarify whether or not the biological identity of the embryo is essentially related to the identity of the adult human being that will develop from that. What is the relationship between what I am now and the embryo that I was? That's the key question. Oftentimes you see in these books that they'll talk about the human being with potential, or a potential human being. What is it to be defined as? Are we supposed to call the embryo a potential human being, or a human being with potential? It's a big distinction, and and obviously the answer is that we talk about it as a human being with potential. The body identity of the growing and aging infant remains the same, despite the outward change. And it grows and matures along with the psychological and the spiritual identity of that same human being. I am what I am now, but I was, I was me in the womb. It was I in the womb, we can say. It was I in the womb. Even though when I was in the womb, I didn't speak, I didn't reason, I didn't do any of the things that I'm doing now. But that takes time to develop into that. But doesn't mean that I'm not the same person. It's like saying, that because we lose our skin periodically we lose all of our skin. But does that mean that we are no longer who we were because we no longer have the same skin? No. So it's the same individual that's developing. Thus, the beginning of the biological life is the beginning of life of the whole human being, just as the biological death implies the death of the whole human being. So that's why we summarize, is it man in potency, or is it a real human individual? Some object that until the 14th day after conception, one cannot speak of a human individual, but should speak at most of a man in potency, but not of a real human individual, because at this stage, he has not yet reached the form of the unborn child, as evident. The brain system is not sufficiently formed, so that's the argument. However, this position contradicts the data offered by modern embryology on the coordinated, continuous, and gradual development of the embryo from conception. Experience shows us that if we do not stop the development of the embryo by suppressing it, it inevitably develops into a being of the human species, and only specific pathologies prevent it from developing all the typical capacities of the person. It's interesting for me to hear also when I hear people talk about, embryos being so similar between dog embryos and human embryos. They might look alike, at certain stages. But I always say, well, when it finally develops what it's supposed to be, it's going to be very different. A human being is never going to look like a dog, and a dog is never going to look like a human being. So, it's just part and parcel to the process. So here we're dealing with two key words I keep bringing up: the idea of possible, the possibles, or the potential. So the possibles are, St. Thomas Aquinas talks about this, the possibles, are those that God will possibly create that has not yet created. But potential is not that. Potential is that which he has created that has potential. So the theory of man in potency arises from the confusion between these two different philosophical concepts, between the possibles and the potential. So merely what is possible and what is potential. Possible is that which is not real. It's possible, but it's not real. It's not in act. And it is not capable by itself of passing into act because it's not alive. For example, we can say, it is possible that my grandfather will get the flu. Or, it is possible that my lottery ticket will be drawn. Possibility here indicates something that can happen, but only if external circumstances occur. So it's dependent on external circumstances. Possibles, very important. Potential, on the other hand, is that which is not yet real, but contains within itself the principle to become real, to move into action. Intellectual potential, for instance, is something a child possesses, even if it has not fully developed. If we think of Mozart's musical talent, for instance, we know that before it was cultivated and brought to maturity through his father's care, it was merely potential. It was there, but it was not brought about. But it was there, in there. It wasn't just a possible, it was already in there. So I think this is a really important point, really important distinction between the possibles and the potentials. Possibles is, again, what is not there but can possibly be there. But it's not there. Potential, it's there, and it can become, it will become, given the consequences, what it potentially can become, but it is already there. Now, there's those who speak of potential human being, and they would actually like to regard it as a possible human being. That's what they mean when they say potential. They wanted to regard it as a reality that is not human from the beginning, but becomes so, for example, when implants in a mother's womb. In reality, the human embryo is not potential in this sense, or in the sense of possible, because it is capable of becoming a human by its own virtue without external intervention. The possibles become because of because of external interventions. Potentials become because of what it is in itself. By its own life, the potential becomes actualized. So speaking in philosophical terms, it must be said that the embryo is in potency because it is at the beginning of development, but it is also in act because it contains within itself everything to actualize itself. These are very important distinctions, because we read a lot of different authors today that want to say that we can abort and because it's just a potential human being, and but it's not just a potential human being; it's a human being with potential. And then there's a distinction between, in the potency, passive potency and active potency. Passive potency, which does not pass into act on its own, is important. For example, gametes are in potency a human being because they can concur to form a new individual, unlike the cells that form the liver and the bones, which cannot do so. And so that's a passive potency. And the active potency is that which contains within itself the principle that brings about this development. For example, the embryo in potency is a human being in the sense that it is at the initial stage of a development, but it contains within itself the principle that leads to realization of this development. So it's active potency. So what's the distinction? The passive potency is that it takes, from the outside, not from its own accord. And then to think about the development of the human embryo, Aristotle already stated that the human soul, the vital and at the same time spiritual principle of man, is already in place in the embryo, even if it does not yet exercise its capacities. With respect to the exercise of rationality, the embryo is in potency, but this does not mean that it is a man in potency, in the sense of not yet real. It's real. Those who deny that there is a continuity in the development of the human embryo due to the presence of the same subject developing from the conception to the adult individual still face the difficulty of justifying just how the body's subject can be first non-human and then human. How do you go from non-human to human? Taking into account that man is an individual being to whom corporeality is intrinsic. How do they justify this? And so we conclude with some thoughts about how, the human individuality of the embryo and the possibility of splitting into twins. We have this other objection against human individuality, because it says that, until day 14 is the date that, we split into twins. But there's a professor in Rome, his name is Professor Lucas, and he solves this problem because he says, what happens in twinning is not that one individual converts into two, but that from one individual another originates. It is a unitary biological system, a human individual that from which detaches a part composed of one or more cells, still totipotent, and it continues to redevelop into a new individual organism from the moment of detachment. The individual is a reality in its own right, which does not exclude that it can be divided. For Aristotle, the indivisible reality is not that the individual, but the atom. The atom is the indivisible reality, not the individual. Twinning, therefore, presupposes an individual that grows and develops, and at some point gives rise to another individual, according to an agamic form of reproduction, from a part of the original individual without the latter losing its individuality. And that's what happens. So anyway, I want to thank you for your attention, and I just wanted to make sure that these very simple points, but very clear and important principles are understood. Thank you for your time.